Welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Berkey, and I'll be introducing our speaker this evening. I'm also a board member of the Monterey chapter of the United Nations Association and chair of our Youth Education Committee. Tonight's talk is entitled Solar Energy and Climate Change, The Race is On. This is co-hosted by several groups here at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, the Model UN Club, and the Sustainability Council. In December of last year, a UN conference in France brought together an amazing number of countries in the Paris Accord on climate change. This is an agreement that was approved by all 195 countries attending the conference, and it's to address the issue of global climate change. Then on Friday last week, Earth Day, this agreement was signed by over 160 representatives in New York at the United Nations headquarters. These are tremendous steps in the right direction to address climate change issues globally, and the UN should be congratulated on this important matter. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon states in a UN global trend study, "We have entered a new era of clean energy growth that will fuel opportunity and greater prosperity for every person on the planet. Governments, business, and investors around the world are realizing that the movement to low emissions, climate resilient growth is inevitable and already underway. To succeed," he states, "governments will need to create a level playing field through carbon pricing, removing fossil fuel subsidies, and strengthening regulatory and investment environments." So, we are currently at a critical energy turning point. As our speaker tonight would say, a power shift. And he will address some of these issues as well this evening. We now have clean renewable energy alternatives that are becoming economic rivals to coal and oil, competing purely on cost. A solar energy transition has now arrived at the cutting edge of technical and economic transformation. This evening, we will explore deeper into the next steps and discuss viable current solutions to climate change. Robert Stayton, right here, is the author of the new award-winning book, Power Shift, From Fossil Fuel Energy to Dynamic Solar Power. Robert was also involved in community energy planning efforts, starting Energy Action and Energy Future, both in Santa Cruz, in the early 1980s. These are community-based organizations focused on strategies for sustainable energy future. The community-based planning efforts were decades ahead of their time. And remember, this is right here in the Monterey Bay area. Robert has also taught college courses in physics and solar energy and is recognized locally as a wonderful teacher and instructor at Cabrillo College under their Solar Energy Technology program, a 2-year program there. On a personal note, I had Robert Stayton as a teacher at Cabrillo College, and he was a wonderful teacher of the solar physics course. It started with only 30 students at the school in the fall of 1979, and it didn't take much time before that went to 400 students at the school, many of them adults who were interested in solar energy because of residential uses of solar energy as well. So he was a very popular teacher, and I soon became his TA, his teaching assistant, and you can imagine having 400 students in a class. Do any people remember those Scantron bubble sheets with the number 2 pencils that you write in? Those stacks of 400 of those go quite quickly when you stick them into a machine and they spit them out. That saved me in the class because that was a lot of work getting those tests scored otherwise. Anyway, I appreciated Robert Stayton because he was an amazing teacher. He really broke down the concepts of physics to very simple, clear, and understandable terms. And his analogies, which are also in his book, were done with a minimal amount of intimidating math. I was never very happy with math in high school, so it really got me excited and turned back on by the keen on learning physics at that level. It was wonderful. So I did well as a student, and I realized then what an extraordinary teacher that he was. Robert also walks his talk. In 1997, Robert and his wife built a passive solar energy home in Santa Cruz with off-grid solar photovoltaic system. He has been living with solar energy since then, always looking for new ways to apply solar in his daily life. Climate change researchers often paint a bleak picture and negative picture of our current global warming situation. Robert explains in his book the science behind the crisis and proposes detailed planned blueprint for transition to a renewable-based energy society. Yes, there is hope and positive things we can do. So on that note, I want to, again, stress the title, Solar Energy and Climate Change, the Race is On, and let's give a big welcome to Robert Stayton.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I have to apologize for sitting down in front of you. I have an infection in my foot, and my doctor has said I have to keep it elevated. And it's kind of hard to elevate your foot when you're walking around on a stage. So I'll just sit here and be able to present my stuff and be able to take questions afterwards. You know, we live in a time of unprecedented crisis. The world crisis that we're facing with climate change has never been seen before in human history. And we are doing things today, or need to do things today, that will affect generations, not only ours and the next, but many generations into the future. We are in a race against time. Now let me be clear here, this is not a race to save the planet. The planet will survive without us, perhaps altered, but still functioning. In fact, the planet would probably say, boy, we're glad those guys are gone. They were really messing up a lot of stuff. No, actually, we are in a race to save human civilization. As you know, civilizations have failed in the past before, and there was always another place for a new civilization to arise and take its place. But today, we live in a single globally interlinked world and a single economy that encompasses the entire planet. And we're threatened by a worldwide crisis. So at this point, there's really no place left to start over. This crisis was created mostly from the burning of fossil fuels over the last couple hundred years. This graph shows the content of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, measured quite accurately enough to detect that red squiggle there is the annual fluctuation in the carbon dioxide from the plants that bloom in the northern hemisphere and then die off in the wintertime. So they go through a cycle of releasing and absorbing carbon dioxide, and that shows up as the red squiggle. But the overall line is obviously marching upward, as it has been since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And in total, the human race has increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now by 45%. Now, let that number sink in, because we're talking about the entire atmosphere of the Earth, 100 miles deep and encompassing the entire planet. All of that volume, the content of carbon dioxide has been increased by 45%. And that's all been done by a single species over a period of less than 200 years. Unless you think that this is part of a natural cycle where we're just catching the upward trend, this graph shows the content of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for the last 400,000 years. And it does indeed go through cycles, as you can see, it's the ups and downs. But on this last leg, we may have been on an upward cycle, but we have obviously extended it. And it just keeps going up and up and up. And now we are essentially going off the charts. As a result of all this accumulation of carbon dioxide, which is a global warming agent, absorbs infrared escaping from the surface of the Earth to warm the atmosphere, global temperatures have been gradually rising. And this is a graph of the temperatures since the 1950s. And it includes the fluctuations due to El Nino and La Nina years. But you can see, again, the overall gradual linear increase in the temperatures on the planet, ending on this graph in 2015 with a world record in the hottest year ever. And it beat the old one, which was set way back in 2014. And the first 3 months of this year, January, February, and March, have all been measured as the hottest ever for each of January, February, and March. So look to 2016 to break the record again. Of course, people are well aware of these global warming impacts resulting from this carbon dioxide accumulation, including the threat of rising sea levels that will flood low-lying areas, crops that will get too little rain or too much rain in some cases, species that will be unable to adapt to the new climate conditions and will disappear, and the 2 billion people or so who depend on snow-packed water, that is, glaciers in the mountains that melt during the year and provide them with their water supply. When those glaciers completely melt and dry up, 2 billion people will start looking for a new water source. So here's an alarming headline. New research shows the rate of temperature change is increasing. In other words, global warming is accelerating. It's going faster than at any time in geological history. There's never been a time where the temperature has increased this fast. Here's another alarming headline. This was more recent, April 16th of this year. Greenland ice sheet is melting freakishly early. They've measured 12% of the ice area on the surface of Greenland is already melting. And this usually doesn't begin until late May. Now, the melting of ice in Greenland is particularly dangerous, not only because the water comes off of land and adds to the volume of water in the ocean and raises the water levels, but also because it's fresh water going into seawater. And in the northern latitudes, that seawater usually goes through a cycle called the thermohaline circulation, where the dense, cold seawater sinks to the bottom of the ocean, travels along the bottom of the ocean toward the equator, south, where it gradually warms and rises at the equator to be warmed by the sun, and then flow north again to complete the circulation cycle. And as it flows north, it flows along the east coast of the United States, and there it's called the Gulf Stream current. And then it continues across the Atlantic to Europe, warming Europe. And as we add more fresh water, which is less dense than seawater, less of that water will be sinking, and that circulation pattern will start slowing down, with the result that temperatures on the east coast of the US and in Europe will start to drop. As NASA ice scientist Walt Myers says in this quote, "The concern is that things are moving faster than we thought." Great. On top of this are lurking several possible positive feedback loops. Now, these are climate mechanisms that we are tampering with. And in this case, positive is not a good thing. Let me describe the difference between a negative feedback and a positive feedback. Imagine yourself as a skateboarder inside of a full pipe. And a negative feedback would occur when you roll up the side of the pipe. The force of gravity would tend to pull you back down toward the bottom. In other words, the force opposes your progress up the side of the pipe. Negative feedback is like being pulled back from what you're doing. So it's a self-correcting equilibrium. If you go up the other side, you come back down in the middle. You've all experienced some kind of equilibrium like this. Most systems in nature operate this way, and that's why nature is mostly very stable. A positive feedback, on the other hand, has the force enhancing the progress. In other words, pushing in the same direction you're going. So if you put that same skateboarder on the top of the full pipe and start them rolling off, as you roll down the side, in this case, gravity pulls you in the same direction you're already going. It pulls you forward, and so you go faster and faster. So positive feedback means being pulled forward. As you roll further, the stronger the pull, the faster you go. And you go faster and faster until you encounter, essentially, disaster. And you can see that the longer you wait in this situation to stop or bail out, the harder it will be to stop. As you go faster and faster, it's harder to reverse that process. So it is the nature of positive feedback that you don't want to wait too long. I can name for you tonight 3 potential positive feedback loops that are already operating out there in the atmosphere, but we're not sure what effect they're having yet. The first is the melting Arctic ice loop. You're probably familiar with it. The warmer temperatures melt some of the ice in the Arctic. The ice is white, and as it melts, it leaves behind dark seawater. This darker seawater absorbs more sunlight, which absorbs more heat in the Arctic area. That extra heat melts more ice. You can see what happens here. It's a loop. Melting ice absorbs more heat melts more ice. So you repeat that loop until all the ice is gone. Now, this fact has actually been witnessed in the northern latitudes because of the cycle of the Arctic thaw every spring. In this case now, the enhancement through global warming means that there's more melting every spring. So the cycle has gotten much bigger, and it's not recovering as well. So we're gradually melting all of the Arctic ice, and they expect at sometime in the mid-century that the North Pole will be free of ice at some time of the year. The second feedback loop I can point out is the melting permafrost loop. Here, warmer temperatures melt some permafrost in the northern latitudes, which is frozen ground that's been frozen for centuries. The methane trapped in the frozen ground is released. Now, methane is a very strong greenhouse gas, and as it accumulates in the atmosphere, it traps more heat. More heat melts more permafrost. Again, repeat the loop until the permafrost is gone. The third one I'll mention is the water vapor loop. The water vapor is actually a strong greenhouse gas. When you have warmer temperatures, it will evaporate more water from the surface of every lake and ocean in the planet. And also, warmer air holds more water, can hold more water in suspension. So gradually, the atmosphere builds up water vapor from this process, and the atmosphere will then absorb more heat because water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. So more heat in the atmosphere evaporates more water, and the cycle continues. In this case, pray for clouds. We stand at the edge of a cliff, essentially blindfolded because we don't know where these positive feedback loops start. We are in a position to actually lose control of the situation. We risk a runaway effect that we simply cannot stop because it's gotten too big. It's imperative that we must act before the feedbacks kick in. Once the first one kicks in, it's possible that it will raise temperatures enough to start another feedback effect, and then another. And it could very quickly spin out of control if it hasn't already. Part of the problem is it's hard to detect when this is actually having an effect. But these are all very likely to take place if we keep pushing on the temperatures on the planet. And again, if we wait until it gets bad, it will be simply too late. The most likely way that global warming will impact humans will be probably through food, particularly food shortages. We've certainly had local food shortages in the past, called famines. And in those situations, we ship food from donor countries to those that are short on food. But now we're facing a situation where the donor countries are having less and less surplus to be able to donate to the countries. And global warming is creating chronic food shortages in regions that are becoming starved of traditional rainfall, with African countries being the most prevalent example. The Anglia-Ruskin University ran models through the Global Sustainability Institute to see what effect this might have. They model the world and the supply of food and the number of people and what happens. And what they found was that if these chronic food shortages continue, and then just 3 catastrophic weather events that trigger crop failures will create shortfalls in all of the basic food crops. And in that case, the prices will spike, people won't be able to afford the food, and there will be food riots across the Middle East, North Africa, and possibly Latin America, which will then lead to migration, and migration most likely will lead to conflict. And basically the problem here is that people simply become a little less civilized when they and their families are starving. And so we see the breakdown then of society through shortages of food. This is a global problem needing a global solution. We are all interconnected. People and goods move everywhere across the surface of the planet. We communicate anywhere and everywhere instantaneously. We exchange economically all around the world. And we all breathe the same air. Yet we are not politically connected. There is no effective world government in operation. The United Nations is essentially advisory only. And of course, it has been advising us for the last 20 years on the climate change and global warming. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had been operating for at least that long and has been providing reports urging governments to take action. Since there is no world government to legislate among all the nations of the planet, we must use the mechanism of the international treaty. The Kyoto Protocol of 1997 was supposed to do that. However, by the time it was finished, it had very weak provisions Its implementation was delayed until 2005 when enough countries finally signed it, and the US never signed it. In fact, the Byrd-Hagel Amendment was passed before it was even enacted, which said that the United States was on record as never supporting the Kyoto Treaty. And then the treaty expired in 2012 with no immediate replacement. There have been annual summits since then to try and create a replacement, and they have had little success until the Paris Climate Summit of 2015. We finally got an agreement. 195 countries have agreed to a 2-degree limit and possibly a 1.5 degree, but that's everyone saying, well, that's pretty unlikely. And as John said, this was signed on April 22nd. However, this is not a strong agreement. Each country gets to decide its own effort in how it's going to deal with global warming. It's not binding. The only enforcement mechanism is really essentially through shaming a country for not meeting its goals. And you know how all countries can be shamed. And there won't be a first evaluation of the results until 2023. And that will be the first time they'll be able to correct the process. And as time marches on, this is not contributing greatly to the overall process. On top of that, we have big oil's obstructive climate lobbying. There was a recent study released by Influence Map in April that documented how the top 3 oil entities in the US, American Petroleum Institute, ExxonMobil, and Shell, are spending a total of $114 million per year to lobby Congress to stop any climate change efforts, which has led to, of course, gridlock in Congress and left us with no national US plan to deal with climate change. The only thing that's happening right now are executive orders created by President Obama. One could say that this is what the effort looks like so far. These are all the countries lining up to pass a single bucket along, and they put one bucket on the big raging forest fire of climate change. Thanks to Tom Tolles for that one. However, this grim picture is balanced by some good news, and that's what the rest of this talk is going to be about. For example, coal is in decline. Texas, of all places, canceled coal plants, many of them in favor of building wind. Norway's National Wealth Fund, which was created from all the oil revenues they extracted out of the North Sea and invests in various entities around the world, is now divesting from coal and investing in renewables, which is ironic considering where the source of the money comes from. Oil money going into renewables. There's something to be said for that. And there are at least 3 coal companies in the last few months that have declared bankruptcy: Peabody Coal, Arch Coal, and Alpha Natural Resources. This has resulted in us being able to decouple carbon dioxide from the economy. Politicians have long said that we cannot cut back on fossil fuels because that would harm the economy, because the burning of fossil fuels has always been linked with a growing economy. But now we have the situation where the measured output of our carbon dioxide has actually declined in the last 2 years, while the economy has continued to grow. So they can no longer claim that fossil fuels are required to grow the economy. This is a very important event that's taken place and removes that argument that politicians have for not doing anything for fear of harming the economy. We can run the economy with less carbon-burning fossil fuels. And don't look to nuclear power to save us. A recent report by the World Financial Review in March outlined all the difficulties that nuclear power is having. It's too expensive compared to solar photovoltaic. It's too difficult to insure, too slow to build. They take 10 to 15 years to build. Too dangerous to operate. Think Fukushima. There's too much nuclear waste already that we don't know how to deal with. There's too much risk of nuclear weapons spreading as a result of all that nuclear waste. And any new nuclear designs that are being proposed are simply too optimistic to be brought online in time for them to make a difference. Fortunately, we have renewable energy, mostly based on energy derived from the sun. And we can gradually substitute these renewable energy sources that are free of carbon emissions. Solar panels, wind turbines, and other renewables, when combined with energy storage, can form a complete energy system for the future. There have been many studies now that have shown that, and I can give you references if you like, or look in the book. And there's no energy miracle needed. Solar PV and solar thermal work today. Wind turbines work today. We have LED lighting to replace the unbelievably inefficient incandescent lighting invented by Thomas Edison, which is in operation is only about 1% efficient. We have electric cars that can replace gas cars, advanced batteries for storage and for cars, smart grids to manage the distributed energy that's produced. All of this is available today, and we just need to spend the money and deploy it. Deploy it and deploy it. The key building block of all of this will be the photovoltaic panel. I say it's key because it has the greatest flexibility, the least environmental impact, and it can work anywhere in the world. PV panels are really modern miracles of energy conversion. They just sit in the sun and generate electricity. They don't move, make noise, they can be mounted out of the way on the roof. They are by far the easiest solar technology to deploy and available to just about anyone. We have been using solar PV since 1997 on our off-grid solar home, very successfully. We use it for lights, computers, water pump, cooking, tools, just about everything. I even have a solar-powered lawnmower. I bought it at Home Depot, and I don't think Home Depot knows they sell solar-powered lawnmowers, but this is just an electric lawnmower, but when I plug it into my solar panels, it becomes a solar-powered lawnmower. And as a result, it emits no air pollution, very little noise, and no carbon dioxide. Solar PV also powers part of our transportation. We own a plug-in Prius, which is a combination of electric car and gas car. And when we plug it in and charge it from our solar panels, we're driving solar miles that emit no carbon dioxide. I'd like to have one of these. This is the Solar Impulse airplane, which just landed in Moffett Field after a flight from Hawaii solely under solar power. But I don't think I'll get one. Solar PV has a lot of advantages over fossil fuels. It does not contribute to global warming because they do not emit carbon dioxide. They don't acidify the oceans because they don't emit carbon dioxide. They don't pollute the air the way burning of fossil fuels do. They don't pollute the water the way the mining of fossil fuels do. And they're safe as any other electrical equipment, of course. And there's more. Solar PV does not produce any radioactive waste. It does not require military defense. When there's turmoil in the Middle East, your PV panels on the roof will not be affected. It saves oil for use as a raw material. We currently use 10 to 50% of the oil that's mined for plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and lots of other material things. And this would save oil for those purposes. Solar PV saves water for other uses. Electrical generation, in most cases, consumes a lot of water. Fracking consumes a lot of water. Solar PV would allow us to preserve that water for other uses. And of course, solar PV is simple enough for a handy homeowner to install. In fact, it's so simple you could say this was a Mickey Mouse technology. This is actually the aerial photograph of the solar PV system that was installed at Walt Disney World in Florida by Duke Energy. It's 5 megawatts of photovoltaic panels spread over a surface of somewhat recognizable shape. PV works in all sizes. This is a very large array of photovoltaic modules to produce 5 megawatts for a large park, but it also works in very small sizes. And this is one of the key applications for photovoltaics, is delivering electricity to people who have never had it. There are about 1 billion people in the world today that have no electricity. And now for the first time, as this example shows in Africa, it's possible to set up a very simple PV system to provide cell phone charging, high efficiency LED lights at night so children can study at night, and refrigeration to be able to preserve food. Oh, there's more advantages. As I said, it works well in all sizes. It's available in all countries, so no country has an exclusive lock on it the way oil is ill-distributed in this world. Solar PV is distributed, not centralized. That means if there's a problem with a system, it doesn't take down a whole area, it just can be isolated because the power is generated in many different places. For businesses, solar PV is particularly advantageous because it provides a stable cost for their energy, so they can predict what their costs will be for energy without worrying about what the utility company is going to do next year or the price of gas is going to do. And it's reliable. It has to be combined with energy storage in order to be reliable, but that's part of the overall system. Solar PV is also good for the local economy. When you buy energy from a utility company or oil company, all those dollars go out of the local community and don't recirculate. But when you buy PV, those energy dollars will be more likely remain in circulation in the local economy. It's good for a national economy, particularly one that import oil. With the same situation, you're not exporting a big chunk of your capital in order to just pay for energy to keep your economy running. Solar PV requires no dedicated land. It can be installed on rooftops, over parking lots, in areas that aren't already used for another purpose. Although you can, of course, dedicate land to it the way the Disney system did. Solar PV is ready to go now. And one of its biggest selling points is that it will not run out, unlike fossil fuels. This is the current mindset about energy, is that it's a limited quantity that must be conserved. The sun just simply doesn't work that way. It'll last about 5 billion years. So. Now, let me clarify that any new technology has its problems, but in the case of photovoltaics, these downsides are manageable or minimal compared to other alternatives. For example, in the manufacturing of photovoltaic panels, it requires some pretty toxic chemicals. But these are all in the manufacturing process and can be controlled at the plant with proper safeguards in place. It takes energy to make the panels, of course, but now that amount of energy is down to less than 2 years of the output of the panel, so that the remaining 18 to 20 years of the panel's life can generate additional energy. And eventually we will see PV factories using PV themselves in a kind of a PV breeder factory. PVs, people sometimes complain that they have a visual impact. And of course, today, most panels are simply look like they've been tacked on the roof, because they literally have been tacked on the roof. Because roofs were not planned ahead for using the sun. But it's very possible to blend photovoltaic panels into the architecture. You can buy panels that simply make up part of the roof today. And I believe in the future that most roofs will be made of photoactive material that serve two purposes: to shed rain and to capture sunlight. And of course, photovoltaic panels' output is intermittent, so we must use energy storage to even out the supply. The thing that's driving the growth of photovoltaics is the drop in price of PV, and it's continuing to drop. It's called the Swanson effect. Basically, it says as you increase the volume of production of photovoltaics, the price of it can go down. So that's what's been happening, and the price has been descending from 1977, when it cost $76 per watt, to where this chart ends, which is 74 cents per watt in 2013. This chart is already way out of date. In 2015, it dropped down to about 50 cents a watt. Of course, this dropping price is driving the growth in how many PV systems are installed each year, and that's what this is a graph of. That's a very nice growing curve, generating a lot of hope for maybe we can do something about this problem of climate change. We have record investments in renewables taking place, $286 billion in renewable investments like last year, more than any other energy technology, and 5% above the previous year. And all of that despite falling prices of fossil fuels. Every time you install a system, it adds to the total. So what this graph is not how many PV systems are installed each year. This is the total accumulation of PV in the world. And this is a very smooth, upward-turning exponential graph. And that's what we want. If we can maintain this smooth, upward-turning exponential graph in the installations and accumulation of photovoltaic systems in the world, then we actually have a chance to win this race. As of February of 2016, the United States had over 1 million PV systems. We reached that milestone just a couple months ago. It took 40 years to get there. But the amazing thing is the growth rate is so fast now that it will only take 2 years to reach the next million installations. Much of the growth is being driven by individuals deciding for themselves, for their homes, for their businesses, for their institutions to install photovoltaics on their rooftops simply because it pays out well. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory did a study of what the total potential was for simply rooftop installations. So they looked at all the different kinds of roofs in the United States and measured out if it was all built out with photovoltaics using current technology, we could generate 39% of all the electricity sold in the United States using just the rooftop. Now, if you add in other areas, such as racks over parking lots, airport land, and highway medians for ground-mounted systems, then you can see how we have the potential for meeting 100% of our electrical needs using photovoltaics. Unless you think we must cover the whole world in photovoltaics in order to meet our needs, that's simply not the case. This is a map showing how much photovoltaics we would need to generate all the energy in use in the world today. This little square right there is a combination of all the smaller squares that are distributed in each country, which show how much area is needed for each country. But all the squares combined means that that's how much area we would need to do in photovoltaics in order to supply all the world's energy needs. It's about the size of Texas. So if we just covered Texas in photovoltaics, we could ship it out to all the world. I don't think the Texans would mind, do you? No, probably not. If you're interested yourself, I suggest that you look up the PV watts calculator, which is a free online calculator for calculating how much a PV system can output. You enter the system size that you might consider building, the location, the tilt, how much it would cost, and it will calculate the kilowatt hours per year and then compare that to the local utility cost. It's a great start. And then you'll probably want to contact a local solar installer to get more details and an estimated price for a real installation for a system. But you can get started with this kind of a thing. Now, let me demolish any excuses you think you might have for not doing this, because there are different options for doing solar. No money? Well, get a loan. I say that because a solar photovoltaic system is a long-lasting system. So getting a loan for something you need up front to buy it and then have it work for you over the period of time that the loan is paying out, you're essentially going to be using the savings from the photovoltaic system to pay off the loan. And after the loan is paid off, all that energy is free. If you don't want to get a loan, you could do a lease or a power purchase agreement, but I urge you, if you do so, to please read the fine print, because often getting a loan is a better deal. You live in a cloudy climate? Well, generally, that just means you have to deploy more panels. There's very few places where there's so much cloud that it doesn't work at all. People think of Seattle as being the cloudiest place in the country. But Seattle only needs 38% more panels than a system in Tulsa, Oklahoma to produce the same amount of electricity. So the folks in Seattle have to spend a little more, but they can still operate on solar. And there are solar systems in Alaska. No access to the sun? Well, one thing you could do is sign up for the green option from your local utility. Utility companies are generating renewable energy these days, and they make it available through a special option so that you can sign up for it and get your electricity from renewable sources that way. Or you can join an off-site community solar garden. This is a really great idea. It is a system where you buy into a shared installation that's installed in some sunny location that's not on your property. You get to buy a few of the panels, you own them, and you get all the benefits from those panels. You get the tax credits, you get the value of the electricity generated, and it's arranged through the utility company. So it's as if you had those panels on your roof, but because you don't have a roof, or the roof is in the wrong place or shaded, you can still have panels operating, but they're off-site. In England, they call them solar farms, growing electricity instead of vegetables. Here's another interesting headline. Italian oil company Eni intends to set up solar energy projects. They are planning a 50 megawatt PV installation in Pakistan, and with more plans for India. And they're also involved in researching new solar materials so they can produce their own panels. I also read that the French oil company Total is getting into solar. I think there's lessons to be learned here for some of the American oil companies. Another headline, San Francisco requires new buildings to install solar panels. Starting in 2017, all new buildings under 10 stories must have solar on the roof and operating. This applies to both residential and commercial properties. And of course, you have to have solar access for it to be in effect. Their goal is a 100% renewable energy city by 2020. By the way, the state already requires that 50% of the roof area of commercial buildings to be solar ready. This commitment to 100% renewables has grown up in recent years as our ultimate goal for this race. If we achieve 100% renewables, then we can retire the last of the fossil fuel plants and stop producing carbon dioxide. So far, 8 countries, 55 cities, 61 regions and states, and 9 utilities have committed to 100% renewables at some point in the future. It's also possible at the personal level and the business level. In fact, it's probably easiest at the personal level than trying to get a whole country to do it. To get to 100%, we need more than just PV panels, of course. I call them the 3 key E's to success. The first E is efficiency. We need to reduce our need for new energy. That is, be more efficient in how we use energy. We have lots of room for improvement because almost all of the energy equipment that we have grew up at a time when energy was incredibly cheap, and the efficiency with which it was used was barely a consideration. Now we can produce much more efficient cars, much more efficient houses, much more efficient appliances. So over time, those will be replaced with more efficient models, and we won't need to generate as much energy as we need to today because we won't have such energy hogging things to consume it. The second key here is electrification. All of those gas-burning engines out there need to be converted to electric motors. My electric lawnmower was a perfect example. Electric cars are another very big one. There are some growing pains with this, of course. Converting to electric cars, people have issues with range anxiety and how much time it takes to recharge them, but really, we're in the early days of electric cars, and there's a lot of work being done to improve the charging process and the timing, and that eventually will be improved a lot. Every gas motor that's out there that's consuming fossil fuels will eventually have to be replaced with an electric motor that can be run off of photovoltaic panels. And the third is energy storage, of course, because we must match the supply to the demand. So look at our water systems. We store water when we get it for when we need it. And energy, we will be doing the same thing. We never had to do that before now because fossil fuels essentially come with built-in storage. In fact, that's really the only thing they're good at. I mean, really good at. They've been storing energy for millions of years. So obviously they're good at it. But the problem is when you release that energy, you release the carbon associated with it. So now we need to build separate energy storage, and there's a lot of research and development going on in energy storage, and another area of huge investment in the world. Let me just show you the top 10 solar countries. These are the countries with the highest installed solar electric capacity based on 2014 data. Number 10, South Korea with about 2,400 megawatts. This is a view of a typical solar power plant in South Korea. Number 9, Belgium. You know how big Belgium is? Belgium is one of the smallest countries in the world, and they are number 9 in photovoltaic installations with 3,000 megawatts. This picture shows solar panels on the top of a train tunnel next to a motorway. The energy gathered from the panels powers the traditional and high-speed train lines. Brilliant. Australia is number 8. Now, Australia has lots of sun and lots of space to put panels. So look to Australia to be a future solar superpower. Spain is number 7 with about 5,300 megawatts. A lot of Spain's solar is actually not photovoltaic, but power towers, where there's a boiler placed on the top of a tower surrounded by a field of mirrors that concentrate the sunlight on it to boil water to run a traditional turbine. But even Spain is now not building many of those. They're converting over to photovoltaics because the price of PV continues to drop and makes them more cost effective. Number 6 is France. Nuclear France is going solar. They're not building new nuclear. They're building solar and wind. The United States, number 5, with 18,000 megawatts of photovoltaics. We are the 4th largest country in the world. We are the country that invented PV and had essentially a 40-year head start on the rest of the world. But we're only 5th. Italy is 4th. This one surprised me, because Italy isn't that big. Italy is sunny, and so when you say sunny Italy now, you mean something entirely new. It's powered by the sun. Japan is number 3 with 23,000 megawatts. And this picture shows basically a subdivision in Japan with most of the roofs having photovoltaics installed on it already. There are some new subdivisions in the United States that are being sold as energy efficient or zero energy houses that have built-in PV as part of the selling price for the house. China, number 2. China is a major producer but also a major consumer of PV. And China is wanting to phase out the coal-fired power plants that are choking their cities. They have recognized the problem, and they are acting quickly to try and build more PV. And of course, many Chinese solar panels are imported to the US. The #1 solar country in the world? Germany. Germany has 38,000 megawatts, much bigger than any other country. Germany is demonstrating the path forward. And they did it years ago by instituting a feed-in tariff system where they basically paid people for the electricity they produced from the photovoltaic panels. They didn't give them a tax break on the panels the way they do in this country. They simply paid you a really good price for any solar electricity that you generated and let you go out and decide how and where to build your panels. As long as they produce electricity, they were guaranteed a high price and quickly paid off. So there were many people, ordinary people in Germany that went, hey, you know what? This is a really good deal. I read a story about a dairy farmer in Germany who looked at the numbers and went, wow, okay, and installed photovoltaics on part of his dairy farm, and now he has a second source of income besides his cows. I have to give an honorable mention, a big one, to the #1 country in terms of solar per person, and that would be the Vatican City-State. Of course, they can do that because they're the smallest country in the world as well. But they did install 2,400 panels, 220 kilowatts on the top of a building next to St. Peter's Cathedral. This looks like you could just see them, but you actually can't because they're on the roof of the building. You can't see these from the ground at all. This is what it looks like from the sky. The roof on the bottom with the arrow pointing to it is covered with photovoltaic panels, and it's right next to the St. Peter's Cathedral. They also have now an electric Pope mobile, which presumably they charge with those solar panels. Solar energy endorsed by the Pope. Everybody heard about the Pope's encyclical basically saying that solar energy is a good thing. So with that kind of a blessing, we can go forward and maybe win this race. To put this all in historical perspective, we can divide the history of humans into 3 energy epochs. The period before fossil fuels, from the time we learned to burn wood, create fire, up through around 1800 when we were still burning wood for just about everything, could be called the wood energy epoch. Around 1800, fossil fuels started being used in greater and greater quantities with the invention of the steam engine. And the fossil fuel epoch, which began around 1800, will probably have to end around 2100 if we're going to survive. That's only 300 years from start to finish. And if you look at a generation of being about 25 years, that's only 12 generations for the entire fossil fuel epoch. And now we are beginning the solar epoch. The solar epoch will be created by using fossil fuels to bootstrap us up to solar. And this will be the last energy transition we need to make, because solar systems, while individual equipment will not last forever, the space that's dedicated to them can, and the supply of energy falling on that space can last forever. So essentially, the solar epoch that follows the fossil fuel epoch, the solar epoch can last the lifetime of our star, which is about 5 billion years, and if you do the math, that's about 200 million generations. Ours will be the first generation of these millions of generations of people using solar power sources, stretching indefinitely into the future. I hope you can appreciate what a monumental point in time this is. I personally feel honored to be part of this beginning. I feel like a pioneer. But we are not there yet. The race with time is accelerating. Global warming is growing faster than expected. But renewables are also growing faster than expected. What's really great is that public awareness has grown tremendously. Many more people are aware of climate change now and are convinced that it's happening and needs to be dealt with. And of course, solar has very high approval ratings around the world. There's very little political resistance to solar except from entrenched interests who are threatened by it, such as electric utilities and fossil fuel companies. Will we win this race? No one knows. This is really uncertain because of the so many variables, and no one can predict the future. You can create models, you can make predictions, but they're all based on assumptions, and no one knows whether those assumptions will play out. However, we do know that the outcome can be influenced by us. And because of that, we have no choice but to try. And we need not wait for the world leaders to act. Solar photovoltaics is something that we can do ourselves at every level. You can act today. We have before us an opportunity to advance human civilization to the next level, to a clean and permanent energy system. The next few decades will determine if we act on that opportunity and step into the sunshine. If you want more details, I offer my book as providing a lot of background on this material and many more details on the projections into the future. So this talk was not just a plug for my book, but I wanted to mention it in case you wanted to learn more about it. So thank you very much. How are we doing?
Let's take about 10, 15 minutes for questions for Robert Stayton. Yeah. Any questions?
How long does a PV panel last, like 20 years?
How long does a PV panel last? Yes, 20 or more years. Most of them are guaranteed for 20 years. Mine, the first ones I installed in 1997 are still operating. I did some measurements on them a couple years ago to see if they had deteriorated, and I couldn't detect any decline in output from them. So if they're well made. Some of the newer designs for PV panels, like thin film panels, the goal is to be 20 years, and they just don't have as much track record yet to see if they are. Yes? Okay, she was saying that the PV panels last 20 years, so we will have to continuously manufacture them. Right. And that's correct, to replace the ones that die after 20 years, if they do die. Mine are 19 years and counting. There are panels that are older than 20 years, first of all, that are still operating at 80% of their capacity. So they won't all have to be replaced at the end of 20 years. But they do need to be replaced eventually, and there is a cost involved in doing that. But during that 20-year period, the manufacturing costs will most likely go down further. So I can't predict what they will cost in the future, but I can tell you that today they cost around 50 cents per watt. That is, if you have a 200-watt panel, you multiply that by 50 cents, it costs you about $100.
What kind of raw materials are required?
Okay, what kind of raw materials are required? Most of the panels today are built out of silicon. The primary material is silicon, which is derived from sand. There's no shortage of silicon sand. The extra materials that are used in the manufacture, some of them use rare metals. And there have been studies, because of that concern, about whether there are enough of those. And today, there are projected for the future of PV, those will not be a limitation. And in the future, we'll also be able to recycle panels.
How do you recycle these used panels?
There is concern about the recycling of panels, particularly some of the ones that use some of the rare earth metals. And in Europe, they actually have a program where you do recycle your panels. And that program is being used as a model for other countries. It has not been adopted in the US yet. But the recycling of panels is certainly something we can do, just as we recycle lead batteries to keep the lead out of the environment. And particularly if these rare metals are valuable, recycling them will have value. So the materials that go into the panel, the glass, the aluminum, and the photovoltaic materials themselves can, for the most part, be recycled. Yes, sir?
Is there a difference between the silicon-based panels that are used for residential purposes usually and the very large solar array installations that they're starting to develop as power plants in Arizona and places like that?
So the question was, is there a difference between the kinds of panels that are used, the silicon panels that are used for homes, and those that are used for the very large power plant arrays in Arizona and California and such? Yes, there can be a difference. Many of the largest power plants are using thin film panels. In a thin film panel, instead of growing the silicon and then slicing it into wafers, they use like a glass substrate and evaporate layers onto it. And those layers are extremely thin and use very little material, and that's why they can be a lot cheaper. Unfortunately, it also leads to degradation of the panels over a shorter period of time, and that's been the struggle with thin film panels, is to make sure they last long enough. And they've solved most of those problems now, and most of the thin film panels can be guaranteed for 20 years. And you can buy thin film panels for your home too. They're some of the cheapest you can buy. Many people still trust solid state silicon panels more. Myself, I have all solid silicon panels because I know that they work into the future. I don't have to worry about it. Yes, sir.
Well, it seems to me that one of the keys you mentioned is energy storage. And it seems like that's probably technically and economically a difficult hurdle. I mean, because we only have good solar energy for a few hours a day, and you've got the whole rest of the day
Yeah.
you have to store it.
Yes, the question was, what about energy storage? Because that adds a whole other component and expense to the system. And indeed it does. When I built my off-grid solar home, I included as part of the design of the system a set of batteries. And those batteries have to be maintained and after a period of 10 years replaced. And that's part of the expense of the system. So if you do go to an energy storage system, you have to include the cost of that and the maintenance of it as part of the overall package. I don't believe most people will be installing energy storage systems on their own home. I don't think it's necessary. I think the utility company is in a better position to put in place large energy storage systems. For example, in Germany, they have big battery banks which are simply low buildings that have huge arrays of lithium-ion batteries, which the utility company uses to absorb the excess solar electricity during the day and make it available at night. And that becomes part of the service that the utility company is providing. Now, batteries is just one method of energy storage. There are literally dozens of ways to store electricity besides batteries. So there's a lot of research in energy storage, and as I point out, it is an essential component for the success of 100% solar. It won't work without it. So we have to roll that cost into the whole system, not just the cost of the panels, but the cost of the energy storage system as well. Yes, sir, back there.
What do you think of Tesla's Powerwall?
What do I think of Tesla's Powerwall? I think it's a great commercial venture, and I think it will have a significant impact because of the credibility that he brings to the whole idea of battery energy storage. He's already pre-sold a lot of it, and there are places in the country now where they're starting to use batteries. For example, in Hawaii, Hawaii has a great solar energy base, but the utility commission there recently stopped the net metering program, which allowed the utility company to absorb the excess during the day and give it back at night. So what people are doing there now is installing battery systems for themselves so that they can get around that problem. Yes?
The battery bank system that you were mentioning that's used in Germany, does it have to operate like a battery farm where they have the panels that are connected to the banks, or can your phone panels be also connected to the storage bank?
The question was, does the battery bank have to be located where the solar panels are? Is that the question? No, not with the power grid. If you feed your power into the grid, it can be transmitted to a location that's off-site and stored there. So it's not necessarily the same electricity. It's sort of like the money system. You know, you put money into a bank, but when you withdraw money, you don't get the same money back, but you get the equivalent amount. So that's how it's accounted for. So we don't count the electrons, we count the value of the electrons.
There's a point at which all those resources are going to be exhausted. So to me, it seems that one very important issue is the energy efficiency and energy consumption, and also decreased consumption.
Yes, what you're saying is that we can't replace our current level of energy consumption with renewables. We have to put in place more efficient systems, and I agree 100% with that. Most estimates suggest that we could reduce our energy use by at least half. And if you read Amory Lovins, you would think we could reduce it by about 80% and still meet our energy needs. Again, if you think of trying to run a 4,000 pound SUV on solar electricity, it's not a good idea. It's a bad design to start with. So you start over. You start with a much lighter vehicle, and you design it around the idea of making it as efficient as possible so you can use less resources. And so that is part of the whole overall process, is using the energy much more efficiently. If you do it that way, instead of just ramping up solar indefinitely, as you ramp up the solar, you bring down the demand, and they will meet much sooner if you do it that way. And that's the goal, to try and do this over the period of 40, 50 years. I mean, it will take a long time to replace all of our existing fossil fuel-based energy systems with renewables. But there is no inherent barrier to doing that. It's mostly political and economic barriers. There's no technical barrier for doing it. The material supply is there to do it.
What is the position of the big utility companies, PG&E and Duke? And
What is the big position of the big utility companies? Well, that's an interesting story. They are being dragged kicking and screaming into this, essentially, by the public utility commissions, because from their point of view, their traditional role has been to generate electricity and distribute it to everyone, and you pay for it. Now they have the situation of they have to absorb electricity generated by other people and distribute it, and with the net metering, they have to do that essentially for free, and they object to that. And it's true, net metering is not economically viable for the long term, but it's meant as an incentive, so that they would absorb that cost and distribute it to other ratepayers to incentivize people to install solar systems. In the long run, something more like a feed-in tariff makes more sense, where they are paying people for the value of the electricity that's being generated and fed into the system, and they can add value to it and send it back out. My own feeling is that utilities will eventually be changed from being generators to being transmission and storage services, rather than the primary source of generation. But they are resisting. Many of them are changing their role and adapting. If they don't see the handwriting on the wall, then they better soon, because it's happening whether they go along or not. Many of the places where the net metering has been dropped is because of lobbying by the local utility company.
I'm wondering if, because we're not 100% solar yet, is it because of legislation in Washington? Or is it because, you know, one-house families and individual people are just not on board yet?
She's asking why we're not at 100% solar yet, whether it's legislation or because of people just haven't done it yet. We're not at 100% because we're starting from scratch, essentially. And it takes a long time to ramp up such a huge change. Not everyone could do it at once, even if they wanted to. But the growth rate that you're seeing, that exponential curve that you saw, as long as we keep ramping up every year the capability of producing more panels and making them available to more people, we will gradually, over time, it'll take several decades just to make the transition. So no, we're not 100% today, although an individual could be if they make the investment for themselves. For the entire economy, though, it's going to take a lot of time to replace all of that equipment. It's just energy is the basis of all of our economies, and changing them overnight is simply not possible. But the nice thing is that we can do it gradually, step by step, without creating massive problems and without creating great risk. We can learn as we go and make improvements as we go.
Well, as promised, he's a wonderful teacher, isn't he? It's been great. Thank you, Bob.